January 11th, 1944. A bitter wind sweeps across the frozen runways of southern England. Engines roar in unison, a thunder that shakes the morning mist. One by one, the B-17 flying fortresses of the U.S. 8th Air Force lift into the pale sky, their silver wings glinting weakly through the clouds. Inside each, 10 young men breathe frost into their oxygen masks. Across the channel, in Germany, radar stations come alive. The word spreads quickly through Luftwaffe command posts. Grosse Formation, heading east. Officers glance at the wall maps. The targets lie deep inside the Reich, over 400 miles away. They know what this means. 8 hours out, 8 hours back, through flak corridors and fighter ambushes. Few in the Luftwaffe believe the Americans will survive the trip. They've seen it before. Burning wrecks falling from the high sky, parachutes swallowed by smoke. The Germans called them daylight suicides. But by dusk, as the first faint rumble of engines drifts back over the English coast, the impossible becomes real. Ragged formations appear on the horizon, limping, bullet-torn, but still flying home. The question that haunted German officers was simple. How did those planes ever come back? When America entered the Second World War in December 1941, the skies over Europe already burned nightly. The Royal Air Force had been waging a relentless bombing campaign against Nazi Germany, but only under the cover of darkness. Their losses in daylight had been catastrophic. German radar, flak, and Messerschmitt fighters had made sure of that. The Germans concluded that daylight bombing was suicide. But across the Atlantic, the USARFs believed differently. They carried with them a dangerous conviction that with disciplined formations, heavy defensive armament, and precise aiming technology, they could hit targets accurately in daylight and survive. It was a philosophy born in pre-war optimism and shaped by two machines that would come to symbolize American air power: the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator. The Flying Fortress was a legend even before it truly went to war, bristling with up to 13.5 caliber machine guns, armored fuel tanks, and a wingspan that could hold the punishment of flak and still hold the sky. Its designers had built not just a bomber, but a weapon of endurance. The Norden bomb site, guarded like a state secret, promised mathematical accuracy from 6 miles high. To its creators, it was the key to precision bombing, the ability to strike only factories, rail yards, and oil plants, leaving civilian areas untouched. In theory, it was the humane science of war. By mid-1942, the first American bomb groups began arriving in Britain, joining the newly formed 8th Air Force. They were young, confident, and untested. On August 17, 1942, a dozen B-17s launched the first American raid over occupied France. It was small, almost symbolic, but it marked the beginning of a campaign that would grow into one of the most dangerous undertakings of the war. Their mission? Dismantle Hitler's industrial heart, piece by piece. Factories in the Ruhr Valley, refineries in Luna and Merseburg, ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, aircraft assembly lines in Regensburg. The Americans would go after them all in broad daylight, with bombs guided by calculation and courage. But the airmen soon discovered the arithmetic of war had its own rules. Flying at 25,000 feet meant sub-zero temperatures, oxygen starvation, and black puffs of flak bursting all around. The German defenses were precise and layered. Radar picked up formations hundreds of miles out. Flak batteries zeroed in by the minute. Then came the fighters. Waves of Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190s slashing through the bomber streams. Every mission cost men, Dozens of bombers went down each week. Crews who had trained together, laughed together, vanished in seconds. Still, American commanders refused to turn back. Major General Ira Aker, the calm architect of the daylight bombing doctrine, believed that endurance itself was a weapon, that showing the Germans those silver plains again and again would erode their will as surely as the bombs eroded their factories. The 8th Air Force grew rapidly. By early 1943, its bases across East Anglia buzzed with activity. Hundreds of B-17s lined up wing to wing, their tails marked by unit letters that would soon become famous. Triangle A, Square D, Circle J. Each dawn began the same way. Crews gathered in cold briefing rooms, staring at maps with red lines stretching deep into Germany. Coffee trembled in metal cups. Over the loudspeaker came the words, "No one ever forgot." "Gentlemen, today's target is..." Then the long silence. Day after day, they launched, through storms, through interceptors, through the black smoke of cities they would never see from the ground. To the Germans, it seemed madness. How could any army throw men into the air again and again when so few returned? But to the Americans, it was duty, calculation, and faith that by mastering the air, they could shorten the war and one day come home. And as the raids grew longer, the distances greater, and the skies more lethal, a question began to haunt both sides. Could daylight bombing truly break the Reich, or would it break the men who carried it out? By the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force had transformed from a fledgling force into a vast aerial armada. Its mission, once experimental, was now central to Allied strategy, to carve open the German war machine from above. But the cost was growing unbearable. Each raid meant 8 to 10 hours of tension, 4 hours in, 4 hours out. No escort could protect them all the way to their targets yet. The twin-engine P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings lacked the range to follow the bombers deep into Germany. They would peel off somewhere over the Rhine, leaving the formations alone in enemy skies. That was when the Luftwaffe struck hardest. German air defense was a masterpiece of coordination. From radar towers along the coast to command centers deep in the Reich, each American wave was tracked in real time. Flak units prepared in belts, and squadrons of fighters were scrambled from airfields like Schweinfurt, Augsburg, and Stuttgart. The defenders knew precisely where to strike. High above, inside the bombers, there was no place to hide. The gunner's world was measured in seconds. Black smoke, tracer fire, then the violent shudder of impact. Crews watched neighboring planes take direct hits, break apart, or vanish in a flash of flame. Still, the 8th Air Force pressed on. General Henry Hap Arnold and General Carl Spaatz, watching from Washington and London, insisted the offensive must continue. Every pound of bombs dropped on the Reich meant less resistance on the beaches when the time came for invasion. But they also knew morale was thinning. In the German command, confidence reigned. Field Marshal Erhard Milchi, overseeing the Luftwaffe's production, remarked that the Americans will not persist, their losses are impossible. Luftwaffe Commander Hermann Göring echoed the same belief in his briefings. No bomber can reach Berlin. If they do, you may call me Meyer. Yet, across the English countryside, crews kept proving them wrong. Factories and oil plants deep in Germany began to feel the sting of precision bombing. The Regensburg Aircraft Works, the synthetic oil refineries at Politz, and the ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, all vital cogs in Hitler's war machine, found themselves under constant threat. But every success came at a horrific price. On October 14, 1943, later known as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force launched its second raid on Schweinfurt. Of 291 bombers sent, 60 were lost. Another 17 were so damaged they never flew again. Out of 2,900 airmen, 650 were killed, wounded, or captured. Nearly 1 in 5 did not return. When the survivors landed back in England, ground crews counted the bullet holes and missing engines. They knew something had to change. The bombers could fight bravely, but courage alone could not defeat an enemy who controlled the air. In Berlin, German officers watched the reports with a strange mixture of pride and disbelief. They had inflicted crushing losses, yet the Americans kept coming. No other enemy had shown such mechanical endurance, such industrial persistence. It was not the same kind of war they were used to. The answer lay partly in America's immense production capacity. While the Luftwaffe struggled to replace its dwindling fighter force, U.S. factories were producing B-17s faster than Germany could shoot them down, nearly 400 every month by late 1943. Each lost fortress seemed instantly replaced by another, bearing new paint, new crew, same mission. Meanwhile, strategic command shifted hands. General Jimmy Doolittle, the man who had once bombed Tokyo, was now preparing to reshape the air war in Europe. His philosophy was simple: control the sky, and victory would follow. But before that control could be seized, the bombers would have to endure one more chapter of near-suicidal missions: the great raids of 1943 and early 1944, when German officers still believed no plane could return from such distances alive. And as the dawns of those missions approached, England's runways once again trembled under the weight of hundreds of engines warming in the dark. This was not just a contest of steel and fuel, it was a test of will. Inside the fortress. At 25,000 feet, the world was a frozen desert. Inside the B-17, oxygen hissed through rubber masks, and the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The men wore layers of fleece and leather, but still their hands went numb against the steel of the guns. The noise was constant, 4 roaring Wright Cyclone engines vibrating through every rivet. A bomber crew was a small, fragile universe of 10 souls: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineer, and 5 gunners. Each relied entirely on the others. When a waist gunner went silent, the others knew something was wrong: a wound, or worse, a hit that had torn the compartment apart. They rarely saw their enemy up close, just flashes of silver crossing their field of vision, followed by streams of tracers arcing toward them. A second later, the aircraft shook as rounds slammed into the fuselage. The crew's world shrank to their instruments and their prayers. Yet, amid the terror, there was rhythm: the navigator's calm voice over the intercom, the bombardier calling "bombs away," the pilot easing the fortress back into formation, even with one engine dead. Their courage was not cinematic, it was mechanical, the habit of doing one's job when every instinct screamed to bail out. Every returning aircraft carried scars: shattered plexiglass, torn aluminum patched with metal sheets, sometimes blood frozen solid on the floor. But as long as the wheels touched down on English soil, the mission was counted as a success. And every survivor knew that tomorrow the same mission might end differently. The machines of endurance. The B-17 Flying Fortress was born from a simple requirement: a bomber that could defend itself. Boeing's engineers gave it strength beyond expectation. Its thick, semi-monocoque fuselage and redundant control systems allowed it to keep flying even after catastrophic damage. There are verified reports of fortresses returning home with entire sections of their tails missing, holes large enough to crawl through. Each plane carried roughly 8,000 pounds of bombs and burned 2,700 gallons of fuel on a typical mission. The defensive armament, up to 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns, created overlapping fields of fire that turned formations into moving fortresses in the sky. When flown in tight combat boxes, the interlocking guns of dozens of aircraft created a deadly wall for attacking fighters to breach. But technology alone could not guarantee survival. The Norden bomb sight, hailed as the most precise device of its time, often proved useless through cloud or smoke. Bombers had to fly in straight, predictable lines during bombing runs, making them easy targets for flak. Precision was a dream that cost lives. The Germans, meanwhile, developed their own deadly tools. Radar-guided flak guns, 88mm and 105mm, were capable of firing 20 rounds per minute with timed fuses. One accurate burst could shred an entire formation. Still, the technological duel favored scale. American factories, untouched by war, poured out new bombers, engines, and ammunition faster than Germany could replace its losses. Every improvement in armor or weaponry arrived not in years, but in months. The 8th Air Force became not just a fighting force, but an industrial process. The assembly line extended into the sky. Inside the Luftwaffe. From the German perspective, the daylight raids were both a tactical puzzle and a psychological shock. The scale of American formations was unlike anything they had ever faced. Luftwaffe pilots climbed to intercept from airfields scattered across Western Europe. They formed Sturmgruppen, specialized assault wings trained to attack head-on, firing 20mm and 30mm cannons into the dense formations. The tactic was deadly, but suicidal. Closing speeds exceeded 600 miles per hour, giving pilots mere seconds to fire before crashing or overshooting. Flak units coordinated with fighter command centers, plotting courses and altitudes. Cities like Hamburg, Bremen, and Hanover bristled with anti-aircraft guns, the so-called flak belts that turned the sky into a killing field. And yet, as the months went on, something began to unsettle even the most hardened Luftwaffe officers. Despite staggering losses, the Americans kept coming. Every few weeks, new formations appeared, larger than before. For each bomber shot down, another seemed to take its place. German intelligence reported that U.S. production was outpacing destruction by more than 3-to-1. Pilots who had once mocked the suicidal Yankees began to sense something deeper, that Germany was fighting not just an air force, but an entire industrial civilization. General Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, later wrote, "We could shoot them down by the hundreds, but they would come again. It was not a question of courage, but of endless resources." In command rooms across Germany, officers stared at the maps and wondered how long this could continue. The bombers kept pushing farther east, towards Leipzig, Frankfurt, and eventually Berlin itself. The question was no longer if the Americans would return, but how many would make it home each time. And that question would soon collide with the reality of what those men endured at the limits of endurance and range, and what their survival would mean for the outcome of the air war. The logic of daylight. The British had chosen to bomb by night for a reason: survival. Under the cover of darkness, their bombers could evade the worst of German air defenses, even if accuracy suffered. The Americans, however, believed that true victory demanded precision. It was a clash of philosophies. The U.S. doctrine, forged in the pre-war Air Corps Tactical School, claimed that by striking critical industrial choke points, oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, they could paralyze the enemy's entire war economy. One bomb on the right target could achieve what 1,000 scattered over cities could not. To do that, the bombers had to see their targets, hence daylight. The 8th Air Force developed strict formation tactics. Bombers flew in combat boxes, layered, interlocking formations that maximized defensive firepower and minimized exposure. The lead plane carried the bombardier responsible for guiding the entire formation's bomb release using the Norden bomb sight. But the precision dream came with brutal consequences. Flying in tight formation made evasion impossible. When the lead plane was hit, dozens behind it were trapped in predictable paths. Flak batteries learned to time their shells to those routes, and Luftwaffe fighters concentrated their attacks on the vulnerable front and low elements. Despite these losses, American commanders persisted. They understood that daylight bombing was not just a tactic, it was psychological warfare. Each raid forced the Germans to divert thousands of guns and men and planes to home defense. Each wave of bombers tied down precious resources that could have been used against the Soviets or in the Mediterranean. By 1943, the sky itself had become a front line. The 8th Air Force wasn't merely bombing factories, it was draining Germany's strength, one sortie at a time. The logic of daylight precision may have seemed cruel and costly, but behind it lay the arithmetic of total war, a belief that victory would belong not to the side that fought hardest, but to the one that could keep fighting longest. And as German officers watched formation after formation cross their skies, they began to realize that this logic, cold, industrial, relentless, might be one Germany could not match. Precision and destruction. In theory, daylight bombing was supposed to be moral warfare, a clean strike against industry, not humanity. American briefings emphasized it constantly. We do not bomb civilians, we bomb factories. The Norden bomb sight was marketed to crews as a device that could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 6 miles high. But in practice, war defied such promises. Smoke, clouds, and wind made accuracy unreliable. Bombs fell miles off target. Entire neighborhoods burned beside the factories they were meant to spare. Civilians died in their tens of thousands, not by intent, but by proximity. Crews who had believed they were waging a precise, almost scientific war began to see the grim truth through their bomb bay doors. The explosions below were not neat surgical punctures, they were vast, rolling waves of fire. For many airmen, this realization left a quiet burden. They were told their missions would shorten the war, that each successful raid might save lives in the long run, but that did little to ease the memory of what they had seen from above. Still, most clung to the belief that their campaign was necessary, that breaking the German war machine would hasten liberation. For them, precision was not moral perfection, but moral intent. They could not control where every bomb fell, only that they had aimed with conscience. In Germany, the perception was different. Civilians under the bomber streams saw only destruction. To them, the precision promised by American propaganda was indistinguishable from terror. Factories were often nestled between homes, hospitals, and schools. Each air raid drove deeper the conviction that this was not just war, it was annihilation. The moral frontier of the air war blurred with every mission, until even the crews who dropped the bombs struggled to define its boundaries. When the bombers returned. For the Luftwaffe, the most demoralizing sight was not the bombers arriving, it was the bombers returning. After every raid, German officers stood over their operations maps, calculating how many enemy planes had been reported destroyed. They expected none to survive an 8-hour round trip through their defenses. But time and again, reports from coastal observers contradicted them. Crippled but defiant formations were limping back across the channel. That moment, when the impossible engines were heard again over England, shattered a silent assumption within the German command. No army, they believed, could sustain such losses. No nation could replace so many men, so many planes. Yet, America did. And the return of even a handful of battered bombers symbolized something larger.
that industrial might and human resilience had merged into a single weapon. Captured Luftwaffe officers later spoke of their astonishment. "We would see the same groups return within days," one recalled. "It was like fighting a machine that never tired." This endurance began to eat at German morale. Fighter pilots grew weary, flak crews dispirited. For every fortress that fell, another rose to take its place. The rhythm of raids, unbroken, mechanical, endless, became a grim prophecy of Germany's defeat. For the Americans, survival itself became a message. Each returning aircraft, riddled with holes and blackened by fire, was living proof that the Reich could be reached, and that it could be reached again tomorrow. And soon, the war in the air would reach its decisive turning point, when the tide shifted from mere endurance to dominance, and the Americans found a way not only to reach Germany, but to return from it unbroken.
August 17, 1943. Dawn broke over the English countryside in a haze of mist and exhaust. On the runways of bases from Thurley to Bassingbourn, more than 370 bombers stood ready, the largest American strike force ever assembled to that point. Their targets? The Messerschmitt assembly plant at Regensburg and the vital ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. It would be a twin-pronged operation, a bold, coordinated strike that planners believed could cripple the heart of German aircraft production. But from the beginning, everything went wrong. The Regensburg group was to hit first, continuing on to bases in North Africa after bombing. The Schweinfurt group would follow hours later, returning to England. But early morning fog delayed takeoff, throwing the carefully timed plan into chaos. Instead of synchronized waves, the two forces became separated by more than 3 hours, enough for the Luftwaffe to regroup between attacks. At 8 a.m., the first formation lifted into the air. Hundreds of B-17s, their aluminum skin glinting in the sun, climbed eastward into thin, brittle air. Crews knew they were flying into the deadliest gauntlet yet, deep beyond the reach of Allied escorts, straight into the center of Germany. By mid-morning, German radar screens lit up with the signal, "Massive formation approaching." The alarm raced across the Reich. From France to Bavaria, more than 400 Luftwaffe fighters scrambled. At 10 a.m., over the Rhine, the first attacks began. Focke-Wulf FW-190s came in head-on, cannon shells tearing into the lead elements. Bombers exploded in mid-air, breaking apart in slow, silent arcs. Others drifted out of formation, engines flaming, crews bailing out into white parachutes that vanished in the haze. Still, the formations held together. The discipline drilled into the 8th Air Force showed its worth. Even as men died, the formation did not fracture. By noon, the Regensburg group reached its target. Bombs fell through clear skies onto the Messerschmitt assembly plant, setting hangars ablaze and twisting runways into molten craters. Then, instead of turning back, they pressed south, across the Alps toward North Africa. The long route saved them from interception, but left the northern group terribly exposed. For the Schweinfurt formation, the battle was only beginning. As the second wave crossed into Bavaria, the Luftwaffe, now fully rearmed and refueled, struck again. Dozens of fighters descended in a coordinated assault, ripping through the unescorted bombers. Flak erupted from below, filling the sky with black bursts. Crews were blinded, deafened, and thrown across their compartments. In one formation, an entire squadron vanished in less than 10 minutes. Pilots watched their friends' aircraft spiral downward, leaving trails of burning fuel. Navigator John Comer of the 381st Bomb Group later described the scene. There were planes on fire everywhere. You could see the air shimmer with heat from burning engines. It was like flying through a furnace. Yet, in that furnace, the mission continued. The lead bombardier steadied his sight. The command echoed through the intercoms of dozens of fortresses at once. "Bombs away!" High above Schweinfurt, thousands of pounds of explosives dropped through the smoke. The ball-bearing factories, vital to every tank, plane, and truck in Hitler's arsenal, took direct hits. Fires consumed the industrial district. The cost was staggering. 60 bombers failed to return. Hundreds of men were lost. Of those who survived, many landed crippled with missing engines, shattered canopies, and wounded crewmen frozen to their guns. But strategically, the raid struck a deep blow. Production at Schweinfurt fell by 34% in the following months, forcing the Germans to scatter their factories and stockpile parts. It was a disruption that would haunt the Reich's logistics for the rest of the war. Still, victory felt hollow. When the survivors returned to England that evening, the airfields fell silent. Mechanics counted the empty hardstands. Squadron commanders read casualty lists in disbelief. 1 in every 6 aircraft had not come back. In Berlin, Luftwaffe officers congratulated themselves. Goering boasted that the Americans had finally learned the limits of daylight bombing. "They cannot take such punishment twice," he declared. But he was wrong. Within weeks, the 8th Air Force began planning another deep raid, and this time, their endurance would be matched by something new, something that would change the entire balance of the air war. An escort fighter that could fly with them all the way to the target and back. The next chapter of the air campaign would not just test courage, it would redefine air power itself.
Winter, 1943. The skies over Europe had become a graveyard of aluminum. Despite the devastation at Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the Americans kept coming, wave after wave of flying fortresses, each bristling with guns, each crew praying that this time they'd make it home. But the reality was brutal. Between October and December, the 8th Air Force lost nearly 1,000 bombers, a loss rate so catastrophic that even the most hardened veterans whispered that the daylight offensive might collapse entirely. For Germany, this was their window. If they could bleed the Americans enough, force them to halt the raids, the Reich might buy time to stabilize the Eastern Front and continue its jet aircraft programs. And so, by early 1944, the Luftwaffe prepared for a decisive air battle, the one that would decide control of Europe's skies. But far away, in fields scattered across England, a new sound began to echo over the frozen countryside. It wasn't the deep rumble of B-17 engines. It was sharper, faster, with a tone that almost whined like a blade through air. The P-51 Mustang had arrived. At first, German pilots didn't believe the rumors. The Americans had escort fighters, yes, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, but both lacked the range to follow the bombers into the heart of Germany. The Luftwaffe's defensive belt had always counted on one fact. Once the bombers reached Central Europe, they were alone. But the Mustang changed everything. Powered by the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could fly over 1,600 kilometers, enough to reach Berlin and back. Its speed rivaled the Messerschmitt Bf-109, its climb rate exceeded it, and its guns could tear a bomber apart in seconds. For the first time, the hunters became the hunted. February 20, 1944. Big week. The Allies launched the most concentrated air assault in history. Over 3,800 sorties were flown in 6 days, targeting every major aircraft plant in the Reich. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had into the sky. From the moment the bomber streams crossed the Dutch coast, German interceptors dove in. Me-109s, FW-190s, twin-engine night fighters pressed into daylight duty. But this time, they met the Mustangs. In a matter of hours, the balance of power flipped. P-51s prowled above the bomber formations, diving on German squadrons with devastating precision. Many Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to easy kills against defenseless bombers, suddenly found themselves being hunted by unseen predators in the sun. Veteran ace Adolf Galland later recalled, "We could no longer reach the bombers without fighting through the fighters first. It was as if the sky itself had turned against us." By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe had lost nearly 400 aircraft, and more critically, hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. For Germany, the loss was more than numbers. Their fighter schools could no longer train replacements fast enough. Young, barely trained cadets were being rushed into combat, often shot down within their first mission. Meanwhile, the Americans grew stronger. Production lines back home in Detroit and Seattle were running 24 hours a day. By mid-1944, the U.S. was producing nearly 8,000 aircraft a month, a figure the Germans couldn't even dream of matching. As spring came, the war in the air shifted from defense to annihilation. Now the P-51s didn't just escort bombers, they roamed ahead, sweeping the skies clear of German fighters. They strafed airfields, destroyed trains, and hunted anything with a cross on its wings. One Luftwaffe pilot, after barely surviving a Mustang attack, said, "They came from everywhere, from the clouds, from the sun, from behind us. There was nowhere to hide." By May 1944, the Americans could bomb Berlin in broad daylight with minimal loss, something unimaginable just 6 months earlier. The Germans called it the destroying of the Luftwaffe, the destruction of the Air Force. In desperation, Göring ordered his last reserve, the Me-262 jet fighters, into emergency production, but by then, fuel shortages, bombed factories, and collapsing logistics made it impossible to deploy them in numbers large enough to change the tide. And the bombers kept coming. By summer 1944, as the Allies prepared to invade Normandy, the skies over France and Germany belonged entirely to the United States and Britain. The Luftwaffe, once feared as an invincible machine of the Blitz, was now a shadow of its former self, broken by the relentless grind of American industry and courage. For the men who flew those missions, the cost was almost unbearable. Over 26,000 airmen of the 8th Air Force never came home. But their sacrifice had achieved the impossible. They had shattered Germany's air defenses, crippled its war production, and cleared the path for D-Day. The tide of the war had turned, not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the cold, endless skies above Europe. When the smoke cleared over Europe in mid-1944, the scale of what had happened in the skies was almost impossible to comprehend. In less than a year, the Luftwaffe had gone from a force feared across the world to one gasping for survival. German aircraft production, though still technically immense on paper, had become chaotic and crippled. Allied bombers had systematically leveled factories in Regensburg, Augsburg, Kassel, and Wiener Neustadt. The Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt plants lay in ruins. Even when the Germans managed to produce new aircraft, they had no fuel to fly them. The relentless bombing of synthetic oil refineries at Luna, Politz, and Blechhammer strangled the Reich's lifeline. By autumn 1944, aviation fuel output had dropped by over 90%. Most training flights were canceled. Fighter squadrons were told to conserve fuel by taxiing with engines off and being towed by trucks to the runway. For the Luftwaffe, the result was devastating. The average flight time of a newly graduated German pilot fell to barely 100 hours, compared to over 450 for an American. Many Luftwaffe units were now composed of boys barely out of school, thrown into combat against experienced American and British veterans, flying aircraft with superior range, speed,
and coordination. Meanwhile, the Americans had achieved something no one thought possible: sustained, strategic bombing deep inside enemy territory. By late 1944, the U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces were flying missions with over 1,000 bombers per raid, escorted by hundreds of Mustangs. The scale was industrial, relentless, and precise. The Germans called it the Terrorflieger offensive, the Terror Flyers. But to the Americans, it was a grim necessity. Every mission, every crew lost, was another step toward breaking the Reich's industrial spine. Inside Germany, civilians began to feel the war in a way they never had before. Entire cities vanished overnight under carpet bombing: Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Berlin. The psychological effect was enormous. Once confident officers who had boasted that no bomber will ever reach the Ruhr now stared at blackened ruins. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, would later admit in his memoirs that after the loss of air superiority, Germany's fate was sealed. Even if factories could still function, workers couldn't reach them. Transportation networks were paralyzed, and every daylight hour carried the fear of the droning bombers above. By late 1944, Luftwaffe command was in chaos. Goering issued increasingly desperate orders, demanding miracle defenses. Jet projects like the Me-262 and rocket interceptors like the Me-163 were rushed forward, but the damage had already been done. The skies were no longer theirs. For the American crews, however, the aftermath wasn't victory. It was survival mixed with grief. Many returned from missions only to find half their squadron missing. Airfields across England became silent graveyards of empty bunks, untouched coffee mugs, and photographs pinned beside beds of men who would never return. At Thorpe Abbotts, Kimballton, and Bassingbourn, chaplains held brief ceremonies each night. The names changed daily. But despite the losses, morale remained unbroken. The crews understood something profound: that their endurance in those 8-hour round trips, their return against impossible odds, had turned the war. By holding the line in the air, they made every Allied invasion, every factory bombing, every tank landing in France possible. And deep inside the German command, officers who once mocked American flying boxes now spoke with a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had underestimated an enemy not because of technology, but because of will. The bombers had come, and against all logic, they had returned.
By early 1945, the once mighty Luftwaffe was a shadow haunting its own skies. On paper, it still possessed thousands of aircraft, but few pilots, fewer engines, and almost no fuel. What had begun as Germany's most technologically advanced branch had been systematically dismantled, not in one grand battle, but through 1,000 relentless cuts delivered by American persistence. The Americans had mastered the art of industrial warfare from the air. Every mission, from the Ruhr to Berlin, was no longer about individual bravery. It was about logistics, coordination, and precision on a scale the world had never seen. The 8th Air Force alone dropped over 697,000 tons of bombs on German targets between 1942 and 1945. Factories, refineries, rail yards, and supply depots all vanished under the constant thunder of the flying fortresses and liberators. By March, Allied aircraft outnumbered the Luftwaffe nearly 10-1 in the air. When German radar stations reported incoming raids, they no longer scrambled interceptors. Many had none left to send. Instead, they simply tracked the formations with quiet resignation, watching as the sky darkened under the shadow of American bombers. On the ground, the devastation was beyond repair. Rail lines twisted by bomb blasts, bridges shattered, and oil depots burned endlessly. Trains stopped running. Ammunition couldn't be moved. Tanks couldn't be fueled, and even food deliveries began to collapse.
Germany was being starved from above. Inside Luftwaffe command, a grim silence replaced the old arrogance. Goering, once the proud architect of the Blitz, became increasingly detached, issuing delusional orders to defend with phantom squadrons that no longer existed. Pilots, who once worshipped him as a war hero, now cursed his name quietly in the hangars. The few that remained flew until their luck ran out. Young boys of 17 and 18, the so-called Luftwaffe youth, climbed into aircraft with barely any training, often dying within minutes. Veteran ace Johannes Steinhoff would later describe it bluntly. "We were sending lambs to the slaughter. Every flight was suicide." For the Americans, however, the nightmare wasn't over either. Each mission still meant long hours of cold, fear, and death. The returning formations that landed in England were often torn apart, engines coughing smoke, fuselages shredded, gun turrets frozen from altitude. Ground crews learned to count survival not by aircraft, but by faces. If a crew came back with even 5 men alive, it was considered a blessing. Yet the sheer endurance of the U.S. airmen became legendary. Many flew over 25 missions, the theoretical limit before being rotated home, and volunteered to go again. They understood what was at stake. Each successful raid meant fewer German tanks in the Ardennes, fewer bullets fired at Allied soldiers, and one step closer to ending the war. As Allied ground forces advanced after D-Day, they often found Luftwaffe airfields littered with burned-out aircraft, half-finished jets, and skeletons of men who had once believed they ruled the sky. German officers were stunned to learn that by the war's end, American industry had produced over 300,000 aircraft, while Germany barely managed a fraction of that before collapse. The numbers told the story more clearly than words ever could. By May 1945, the Reich surrendered. The Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its proud eagle, once feared from Warsaw to London, now lay broken in the rubble of its own arrogance. In post-war interrogations, many surviving German officers admitted that they never truly understood the scale of the American war machine. One simply said, "We thought no man could fly that far, through that much fire and live." But they did, again and again. The myth of American endurance had become a reality carved into history. Those 8-hour raids, once dismissed as suicide, had proven that determination, technology, and relentless production could achieve what courage alone could not. And for every German who looked to the sky in disbelief as the bombers returned after each raid, it marked the beginning of the end, not only of the Luftwaffe, but of the war itself. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world looked up at skies forever changed. The air war over Europe had rewritten every assumption about technology, courage, and endurance. For the German officers who had once scoffed at the idea of American bombers surviving an 8-hour round trip, the lesson was harsh but undeniable. The war had not only been fought with bullets and bombs, it had been fought with engines, steel, and time itself. America's true weapon wasn't just the B-17 or the P-41. It was the system behind them, the factories in Detroit and Seattle, the assembly lines where women riveted wings in night shifts, the mechanics who worked in freezing rain on English airfields, and the young airmen who climbed back into the sky even when their odds of survival were barely 50-50. The German war machine had been built on brilliance and speed, the idea of victory through elite engineering and daring tactics. The American machine, by contrast, was built on scale, discipline, and endurance. It was a war of attrition that only a nation capable of replacing every loss and every man could win. Every returning bomber told a story not only of survival, but of the industrial miracle that made survival possible. Each hole in a fuselage, each burned wing that still carried its crew home, was proof that the balance of war had shifted forever.
The skies over Europe became the proving ground of a new kind of warfare, one where victory no longer belonged to the boldest, but to the most prepared. And as German officers watched those bullet-riddled American bombers limp home after each raid, they were forced to confront a truth their ideology could never accept: that power was no longer about invincibility, it was about endurance. By the time the war ended, the echo of those returning engines had already become history's turning point, a sound that marked not just the fall of the Luftwaffe, but the dawn of a new age of air power, one that would define warfare for the next century. Those 8-hour flights were more than missions. They were a testament to courage, to production, and to the human will to return, no matter the odds.